on. So the parsha for tonight is Re, uh, spelled many different ways. R apostrophe E-I-H, R-E apostrophe E-H. In Hebrew, Resh Aleph Hey. It comprises Deuteronomy 11:26 to 16:17. And we're going to be working primarily out of the Union for Reform Judaism's Torah with commentaries. It's the one I have with the largest print, and it works the best. It's usually a pretty neutral, easy to understand language. So please feel free to stop me at any time, ask questions, tell me what you like, and whatnot. And definitely let me know if our broadcasting doesn't drops out at any time, because we might have a little bit of internet issue, but hopefully not. Hopefully everything's working well tonight. So, this parsha is the longest weekly Torah portion in the book of Deuteronomy, although not in the Torah. It's made up of 7,442 Hebrew letters, 126 verses, and can occupy around 258 lines in the Torah scroll. Interesting to note that Parsha Naso of Numbers is the longest in the Torah. But this being over 7,000 characters, you can imagine that even if it was a cohesive story, it would take us longer than 30 minutes and probably longer than an hour for us to do it. But what we're really talking about here is about a third of a whole discourse supposedly from Moses to the people of Israel about what's going on. So we're really looking at about a third or a fourth, about a third of a whole idea, but it's very repetitive. So being so long, what is it that we should be focusing? Well, a good place to start is to recognize that this portion is really just a tiny bit, and that it can be divided itself into much more smaller portions that are very widely varying to figure out what's going on. So what's being conveyed? In this parsha, it's mainly specific ideas that can be divided into two types of laws. These considerations can be subdivided into ritual/moral laws and into civil/social laws. Some of these rules are from previous parshat, and some are new. For example, in this one, false prophets are discussed only here in the Torah, where, well, what you're looking for false prophets, whereas the laws of kashrut that are already repeated in repeated from Leviticus. So here's really our division for Moses from wandering in the desert, and he's saying what will be expected once Israel crosses the River Jordan and becomes a nation, and what they must do and how they must act and what path they're supposed to be on. So according to Maimonides, there are 17 positive and 38 negative commandments. I'm not going to read those out unless you're particularly interested in them. But we'll go through some general ideas of what they are. Let's look at what the laws are that we're going to encounter in the little bits we're going to be reading. So ritual and moral laws. You're going to see the centralization of worship in one place, thus the building of the temple, in chapter 12. Further injunctions against idolatry in 12 and 13. So more talk of keeping the faith and staying away from the ideas of the people around them. And this one's really important because it's what partially is leading to the centralization of the practice of the religion to one place, is that you're seeing Moses set out basically the bureaucracy of how the temple should be set up. You're going from the tabernacle in the wilderness to a fixed building that people must journey to in the in the Promised Land. There's a section on self-mutilation, which they're talking about shaving, tattoos, creating holes, and it's even being stretched to any sort of body modification. And that's really liberal on where you go with that. Then we're going to talk about, we could talk about permitted and forbidden foods, which would be kashrut, in chapter 14. Also, you'll see tithes in that chapter. And that balances out those types of laws for this particular parsha. Now, the civil, criminal, and social laws, so these are the ones that are keeping the society together, are going to be talking about debts and the provision of poverty in chapter 15, the laws of slavery in chapter 15, and the setting of the judges and the courts right at the end, starting the next portion of chapter 16, starting the next parsha. So that's so much to cover that we're going to need to look for a little bit more specific idea. And I couldn't come up with what exactly we should be looking for. So I'm going to bring up some things that I found very interesting throughout the section. And you guys yell if you find anything interesting, and otherwise we'll just keep talking about varying subjects since we find something interesting. So let's start at the very beginning. The first word of this parsha is re, and it means see in Hebrew, or more like look here, pay attention, that idea. And it's really interesting to see that this comes from a singular view. The idea is that this is an attention getter, a discourse to the entire Israel, to the entire group of people, but each individual must make the decision to keep the covenants of the laws that are being set before them. This is kind of the last chance. It's like the end of Rumspringen. You either join the church or you leave, so to speak. Midrash has an interesting little part to say about this, and this is kind of the divine command is what they call this section, 11:26 to 32. And it talks about what to do and where to go. And it says, I set before you blessings and curse. And this is a big topic. The Hebrew saying, sword and book come down from heaven together, is what they're using. And it's that God said, if you observe what is written in the book, you will be saved from the sword. But if not, it will slay you. So if we're supposed to see, we're supposed to behold, as Liani says, we're supposed to look here and take attention, then the first thing we need to look at is, all right, there's blessings and curses. There's a good side to things, and there's a bad side to things. Should we look for the good, and we look for the bad? But if one follows the path that the Torah sets out, then you should live a happier life. Well, what does this mean to me? To me, this says if I live a moral life, if I live a civilly obedient life, falling within the civil and moral laws as best as I can, then I should be happy. They're time-tested ideas. That doesn't mean I shouldn't question them, but it means they're there. They're wisdom of the ages for me to partake of and benefit from. So that's really the most important part about any of Moses's sermons, so to speak, is that he's trying to convey these laws and systems to try and make life better. It's said in Midrash also that in line two choices before us, God urges us to choose the good and helps us if we strive to achieve it. For God does not deal with us in accordance with strict justice. Well, we know that in strict justice not necessarily true, because you look at the way Hashem is portrayed in the Old Testament. It's a very vengeful deity, and therefore you don't necessarily have the best juxtaposition of good and bad, of forgiving and punishment. So that's pretty much the big part. They tell which mountain to go for the curses and which mountain to go for the blessings, but it's all kind of technical, and we don't know exactly which mountains they are, we don't know exactly where they are, and we're not in Israel, so it doesn't really affect us. It's one of those commandments or ideas that we can't necessarily fulfill because of geography. So what is the central sanctuary? We're talking about in basically chapter 12:1 to 13:1. And this is where we're talking about at which point is there going to be a central place to worship. What you should do, you should bring your offerings of the firstborn to redeem the first tithes. This is where you talk about converting the tithes into money so that you can get them to the temple, and at the temple turn it back into offerings. So this is where you get that whole Christian moneylenders thing. But it's all the idea of building the bureaucracy, the infrastructure of what will be the cult atmosphere, in order that everyone stays cohesive, everyone stays together, and stays away from idolatry. And furthermore, the next section, which is false prophets in chapter 13. And that begins there. And this is really interesting because this is where stuff gets really confusing about prophets. The people of Israel are warned when they go into this land that's occupied by the Canaanites that they're going to have people, maybe even close relatives of theirs, that will ask them to worship a different god, or teach them to do stuff, worshiping in a house and building altars, and not following what is the laws that are being set here and reiterated from Leviticus. And in this time period, you're having a lot of different religions, a lot of different cultures clashing, and you have a lot of people staying at home or being out farther away from the centralization of society and building things like altars. And so this is trying to smash this down, and it's going back to the centralization and making this all one cohesive unit, keeping everybody together and smashing that which does not fit within. So they say that there will be prophets and there will be false prophets, and they will have signs. And even if a false prophet is able to produce a sign, that doesn't mean that it's truly them, according to rabbinical tradition. According to the Talmud, it's many different things. It could be that that it's a false prophet, it's a trick. It could be that it's stolen prophecy from the real prophet. It could be that it's just happenstance. It could be that they are so logical that they basically pulled a Sherlock Holmes and figured out what was going to happen. But in the end, the only real test that this section gives us for a prophet is that if the prophecy comes true, then they might be a prophet. And if it comes true, if they show a sign, but it doesn't necessarily come true, maybe it's not. It's really hard. Oh, I like that, Lanny. Easy to spot false prophets today. We call them politicians. Yes, indeed. That's that's kind of what you're getting. You're getting someone that's running on a campaign slogan. This is really great analogy there. Thank you. And you have someone that's running on a campaign slogan. They say, this is what I'm going to do. This is what I'm going to be. This is what law I'm going to pass. And they get into office, and then they pull what's his name, Bob McDonald, and takes all the money and is confusing and whatnot. So you can't tell the false prophet until it's too late. So it's really kind of a redundant, odd section that doesn't really help. It says, you'll find out. Just keep believing in the basic tenets and you'll find out. But what this again goes back to me seeing is that if you live a good life and you do good things, then you will be rewarded in return. So what else do we have? Punishment. So what is the punishment for being a false prophet or trying to get you to idolatry? Even if it's your close relative, your wife, your sister, your mother, your father, it's death. You're just screwed. So you got a whole lot of things going. Death. What else? Yeah, death. It's always death. There's a whole lot of people in this era running around saying they're prophets and not necessarily being. So you've got the I'm sure there were plenty of people that were stoned that just said the wrong word. It's like the life of Brian, if you will. What a wonderful musical. So what else? Chapter 14. Let's talk about 14 and 15. Oh, how Michael says, false prophets who produce signs and put to death. Sounds familiar. Yeah. On foods, tithes, and equity. So, this section talks about two important things. It talks about children, and it talks about households. And I want to kind of break down this, and for instance, reading the injunction of Deuteronomy 14:26, and you shall rejoice in your household. So Midrash teaches us that without a wife dwelling within your household, without her good, without her help, without her joy, without her blessing, without her atonement, then there's no point. So it says wife, but we need to look at this a little more broader. We need to look at this as partner. We need to look at this as household, the whole group. We're looking at children. We're looking at slaves. We're looking at servants. So it's a whole cohesive group that isn't necessarily bonded by blood. And this is an important thought to keep. Because what is it that really makes us? Is our household, is our family, the people that we sweat and bleed for. And this is our community and our chosen family and our partners in life, and this is really what the Torah is all about. And so it's a very interesting to see that it's coming up here over and over again in this section about your household, all the people within the group, and telling them what they can and cannot do. So what else can we talk about? Um, how about one of the most important tenets that comes up in chapter 15, verses 7 through 14. I'm sorry, through 11. This is where we start to talk about giving and tzedakah. And the idea of tzedakah really pans out. And in rabbinical literature, in Talmud, and Midrash, it's often stated things like you should willingly give to those that are in need. You should help a kinsman. You should leave such and such for the gleanings, for the poor and destitute. And and you shouldn't say, oh, the seventh year where I need to have debt forgiveness is coming up next year, and so I don't want to lend someone that needs money or needs help or food them if I'm just going to have to forget it next year. It goes back to without help. Without help, we are nothing. Without the help of others, without the help of family, without the help of society, we can't progress, we can't grow. Like Lanny says, family is the central unit of civilization. It's the basic building block is that family group you make, whether it be biological or social. But this bringing together, this help that brings joy, is what leads us to tzedakah. You should give readily and plenty, because there will always be poor and needy within your group, and so there will always be a need to give. And interestingly enough, Talmud doesn't make a distinction between people who give tzedakah because they really want to, because it blesses their heart, and those that give it because of social obligation. If you do good, you get good, whether or not your heart was in it, apparently. That's the idea anyways. So dietary laws. So what are we getting here? We're getting basically the same thing as we did in Leviticus. Adi is asking, where does it handle the part when you're poor? The only thing I know is to donate time. Well, yes, when you're poor, you're in an economy of time. You have time to glean, you have time to fix, you have time to help, but you don't necessarily have money. And it's basically giving of anything of value. You can look back, and what's sticking in my mind right now is the book of Ruth, and looking at Boaz coming and spending time helping Ruth and Naomi with fixing the house, and sending his servant and spending his servant's time on fixing their dwelling and their crops and whatnot. So again, it's another idea of without help, without building a cohesive group, an organization, a nation, a community, then we can't progress further. We're stuck in the singular. So you have the same basic things that are the same basic dietary laws. I keep going over this. I know I'm getting stuck on it. Too much German cinema. The basic dietary laws are said over and over again, and you can look those back up in Leviticus, and you look them up in Deuteronomy, but nothing's really changed much. But the last main section of this that we're talking about is that Lanny believes in Andrew Zimmerman dietary laws. The last section is kind of talking about the 3 most important festivals considered to be a remembrance of what became before the land, the promised land, and what came after. So you have Passover, you have Pesach, you have Shavuot, and you have Sukkot. And these are all three pilgrimage festivals. So these are all three festivals that are talked about, that are talked about in several other places, but that are specifically set out here into how long you should count from when you first put your scythe in the barley, and how long you should observe Passover, and so on and so forth. But it's really interesting to see that this was when you had to travel to the temple. This is what was bringing you in at least 3 times a year to keep you a part of the whole of the group. And it's also good to distinguish this line that Moses is distinguishing from before in the wandering, and remembering the wandering, and being grateful for the time after, and the acquisition of land and nationhood that is promised, and whatnot. So that's the really big part there. Is that, we're talking about moving Pesach out of just being in homes and moving it to the temple. And sort of I believe it's in this section, it might be in chapter 14, I've forgotten, but a really important quote, I think, to me, and it's because I will never, ever be able to be a vegetarian, complete vegetarian. I try, but I just can't. And it says that if you want to eat meat, you should eat meat. If you have a taste for it. And this is kind of a change from the wandering in the desert, because you have 40 years of eating nothing but manna and restraining from anything else. And that's what you have that's kosher, so that's what you eat. And you're coming into the land of Canaan, and they're going to eat things like quail that you can't eat. And you have to stick to your guns. And so, at this point, they say you can eat sacrificial meat on most of the holidays outside of the centralized temple, because they want to make sure that everybody can eat meat, because you don't have trains and huge mass transit, so you can't move quantities all over the place. So you have to have fish where you have fish, and vegetables where you have vegetables, and meat where you have meat. So that's a really important idea. And I think we often forget that when we go into cash fruit, that we've been given everything green and leafy there is to ingest, but also when we want meat, we should allow ourselves meat. And only then should we allow ourselves meat. Because it is taking of a life. And in here, it is dealing with blood and having to deal with the life force and making sure it's drained out and making sure everything's kosher and so on and so forth. So, I think that really kind of sums up the very, very general idea of what's going on in this chapter. I don't know, it's very disjunct. It's not very cohesive, and that's because it's really just a portion of the whole. It's a parsha. Is there anything that anybody found particularly interesting that you want to talk about further? Is there a section that you find interesting? Or should we leave it there? The Jubilee year concept. That's a good idea. The Jubilee year concept, we kind of glossed over when we were talking about food tithes and social equity in chapter 14 to 15:23. And the Jubilee year is contained within there. I'm not really sure which blind. But the Jubilee year is contained within the year. And so every 7th year, you're supposed to forgive the debt that is before that hasn't been completely paid off. So this is where I'm talking about you should lend out money or food or whatever is needed, even if that Jubilee year is coming up and you're just going to have to forget the debt. You should just bite the bullet because you're part of the community and you need to keep it going. But this Jubilee year also, interestingly, applies to slaves in this section. So if you entered basically a contract of indentured servitude with a Jewish family, and you decided that that you basically wanted to be a slave for whatever reason, because you were poor, because you had no food, because you needed a job, and that was the only way to get food, housing, and shelter, you would be an indentured servant for 7 years. And at the end of 7 years, at the Jubilee point, you are allowed to leave the master. But should you decide to stay, the master is supposed to put the slave up against the door and put an awl through its ear. Exactly. Lotus brought up that drilling a hole in the ear for servants to stay. Exactly. So here we have an interesting justification. Porky pigging on you. An interesting contradiction in that we've talked about you can't do body modification, you're not supposed to make marks or shave or so on and so forth earlier, and now we're saying if you want the slave to stay part of the family, you're supposed to permanently alter them. Now, why would this be? Why would there be a permanent hole in the ear? Well, you have an entire nation of people that are used to making covenants, and when they make a covenant, when they make a contract, they usually make it with a physical sign. You have things like Jacob building altars, you have Moses doing physical signs, and so you have circumcision, and so this is really another outcropping of that. It's making a permanent sign that keeps one bound within the contract. So it's basically making a covenant that the slave has decided, it's been 7 years, I like this family, I'd rather just be a member of the family from now on. So hopefully that wasn't something that was terribly exploited, but in human nature there's always good and evil, and it's what we choose to do with the light and how we choose to deal with the dark that really makes us who we are. And that's what this entire section is all about, is what laws to follow, not specifically why, but what laws to follow in order to try and have a happy, productive house. Lanny says that only applies to Hebrew indentured service. I'm not sure if it applies only to Hebrew or not, but it definitely does apply to Hebrew. Aubrey says, could it be that the purpose was to let it be known that the slave wasn't held against the will, as to avoid the appearance of impropriety? This is another very good idea, because how are you going to have someone necessarily stand still for you to put the awl through their ear? I'm sure there were cases where it was abused, but in general, where you're not going to have a lot of written contracts, you're not going to have a lot of lawyers, you're not going to have a lot of things written, you don't have paper mass produced, you're putting things out on clay tablets and stones, it really makes sense to have a physical sign, like you say, partially because of the keeping up the avoidance of the appearance of impropriety. Lenny points out 12. If your brother, a Hebrew man or a Hebrew woman, is sold to you, he shall serve you for 6 years, and in the 7th year you shall send him forth free from you. Yes, That's where it particularly applies to Hebrew slaves, and doesn't specifically point out slaves of any other group. Although I think what the editors of the Torah were trying to convey was keeping a cohesiveness of households, all being Jewish, all following Jewish laws, because that would perpetuate not only the religion, but the family and the family's name and its deeds. So that's pretty much what I've learned that comes from that. I want to just take another minute and see if there's anything further other than the Jubilee year, the forgiving. Lanny points out the forgiving of debt is only applied to other Jews. That was the usual case. That we're talking about Hebrew to Hebrew in this section, as opposed to dealing with other ethnicities, because right now you're having a whole bunch of reforms meant to keep everyone together, and so they're cutting off those that are outsiders or that don't want to become insiders, because they have to keep everyone together now that they're not wandering in the desert. So that, I think, was a really great study session, and I really appreciate everybody chipping in and bringing up stuff and remembering verses that I couldn't. I think somebody's getting on their Netflix and I'm losing bandwidth, so I will cut it off here. Thank you so much, everyone coming. I hope this was informative, even though it was so widely varying. And I hope to, again, be able to fill in, and I hope to see you around Yom Kippur when we'll be doing something. I haven't quite come up with what we're going to talk about, but we're going to try and do something interesting. Once again, let me reiterate, if you have an idea, a thought, a comment, a question, please feel free to email me at Rivka@punktorah.org. And as always, please feel free to correct me when I'm wrong and send me that information so I can make those changes. Thank you so much to everyone, and have